Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, partners and colleagues, and welcome to Renewable Energy Working Group event for GHG emissions accounting. My name is Hao, and I am the Vietnam country coordinator for Clean Energy Investment Accelerator. And today it is my honor to welcome everyone to our second event of 2023 in collaboration with Greenhouse Gas Protocol on an exciting topic, greenhouse gas emissions accounting, given the climate change crisis we're having nowadays. And firstly, for the event logistics and its technicality, if you have any questions for us, please write in the Q&A box in Zoom, or if you have any technical issues, please let us know in the chat box. Our team will assist you accordingly. And for translation, the event is live in English and Vietnamese. Please choose the language that you prefer. 1 week after the event, we will share the video recording on our video sharing platforms, and the slides of the speakers will also be shared with their approval. And next, I'd like to go over the agenda of today's event. The introduction, a speaker from CEIA will give her presentation on the insights on Vietnam's private sector GHG emission inventory and reduction commitment. After that, we will welcome our speaker from Greenhouse Gas Protocol, who will be presenting about the overview of GHG Protocol stakeholder surveys and standards updates process. And lastly, to provide insights and experience, an expert from our team will share his experience working with the GHG inventory Vietnam. And for some context, our team is a consulting firm that has many years of experience in greenhouse gas auditing. And next, regarding the context of the webinar, REVWG in Vietnam was launched in 2017 by CEIA. Our focus is improving the understanding of the Vietnam's clean energy procurement of corporate energy users and their supply chain partners. We also engage with clean energy solution providers and investors and NGO to improve their understanding of the market activities and challenges. For those who are familiar with CEIA, today's topic is slightly broader than those topics that CEIA has usually covered, which is more clean energy focal. And CEIA, or Clean Energy Investment Accelerator, is co-led by 3 organizations: World Resources Institute, Allied Partners, and National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL. We are supported by our funding perspectives by a variety of partners: DOS, P4G, Terra Climate Foundation. In terms of activities, CEIA works on various market engagements using platforms such as this webinar series on clean energy topics, user supports, policy design with regards to clean energy procurement such as rooftop solar, DPPA, and now GHG solutions. It is also our focus today to provide technical assistance with PFS studies and case study sharing, which we will discuss today. And for our event, for the first speaker, I'd like to invite Ms. Quang Nguyen, Clean Energy Project Associate of Allied Partners, to talk about the status quo of Vietnam's private sector GHG emission inventory and reduction commitment.
Thank you, Ms. Hảo. Can you hear me clearly? Yeah, okay. Thank you, Hảo, for your insightful introduction. So before we dive deeper into the Greenhouse Gas Protocol survey and standards updates, I would like to share some background information about the current regulations on greenhouse gas inventory and reduction commitment for private sector here in Vietnam. So next slide, please. But first of all, how is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and inventory related to our work on the clean energy transition? As you can see here on the graph, the industrial sector is the largest energy end user, which accounted for more than 53% of the total energy consumption here in Vietnam in 2020. And the energy demand for the industry is estimated to grow to 63% in 2040. And mostly the manufacturing companies are the largest consumers of electricity, and they consume about 33% of the total nation's electricity. And the emissions from the energy sector is projected to increase from 28% in 2020 to 43% in 2050 of the total country's emissions. The manufacturing in Vietnam is growing really quickly in the recent time, with account for 48% of total registered investment capital. And that's why we believe that the clean energy transition has been contributing significantly to the reduction of greenhouse gas, not only in Vietnam, but also worldwide. Next slide, please. So now back to our main topic of today, which is the greenhouse gas inventory and reduction in Vietnam for the private sector. So we would like to share some key highlights of the decree number 6, 2022 NDCP issued by the Vietnamese government, which is related to the greenhouse gas inventory and reduction regulations. So which facilities are obligated to conduct their greenhouse gas inventory? And here we can see for general facilities, if they have the annual greenhouse gas emissions from 3,000 tons CO2 equivalent or more, they have to do their greenhouse gas inventory. And other categories like the industrial production facilities or commercial buildings with the total energy, the total annual energy consumption from 1,000 tons of oil equivalent, also known as the TOE or more, or the cargo transport companies with total annual fuel consumption of 1,000 TOE or more, and the solid waste treatment facilities with annual operating capacity of 65,000 tons or more. All of those facilities, factories, organizations need to do their greenhouse gas inventory. Next slide, please. And regarding the timeline for the greenhouse gas inventory in Vietnam, according to the decree number 6, here we can see there are 3 main milestones. First of all, the companies or factories need to provide the activity data and information of their facilities of the year before the reporting period, according to the guidance of the Field Management Ministry before the 31st March 2023, like this year. And about the Field Management Ministry, here, for example, if you have like industrial production factories here in Vietnam, you will need to follow the guidance from the Ministry of Industry and Trade. Or if you have cargo transport companies, you will need to follow the guidance from the Ministry of Transportation, and so on. And after that, factories will need to implement their greenhouse gas inventory and prepare the report every 2 years for the years 2024 and onward, and then submit the report to the Provincial People's Committee before the 31st March 2025. And the next step is to finalize the report and submit it to the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment before the 1st of December 2025. Next slide, please. And regarding the timeline for the greenhouse gas reduction commitment, here we also have some important milestones. Firstly, companies will have to implement measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from 2023 to the end of 2025. And of course, in accordance with their own facilities, production and business conditions. And then they will have to formulate plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from 2026 to the end of 2030. Then update and submit them annually to the relevant authorities, which are the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment, the Field Management Ministry, and the relevant specialized agencies under the Provincial People Committee before the 31st December 2025. And last but not least, companies will need to prepare annual reports on reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and submit them to the relevant authorities by the 31st March from 2027. So above are the key takeaways about from the recent regulations on the greenhouse gas inventory and reduction commitment for the private sector here in Vietnam. And with that, I would like to return the stage to Ms. Hảo and other speakers for further discussion on the topic. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Huê, for the walkthrough of GHG inventory and reduction commitment in Vietnam. Up next, I'd like to invite Mr. Michael McCree from GHG Protocol, who will be presenting an overview of GHG stakeholder surveys and standards update process. And before we move on to the next session, I'd like to remind everyone that you can put your questions in the Q&A session on Zoom. The speakers can either answer directly or we pick some questions for the panel discussion and Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Good morning to everybody, and hello from Boston, Massachusetts, where we currently have about 2 inches of snow on the ground. So I'm guessing slightly different weather where I am seated than many of the audience here today. But I want to start by expressing my gratitude for the time today and our hosts to be able to share what we as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol are starting with this process and underscore the importance of this being a global undertaking and the need to hear from all around the world to understand how we develop, how we enhance, and how we improve the greenhouse gas reporting and quantification standards that WRI, the World Resources Institute, and WBCSD, the World Business Council of Sustainable Development, co-convene through this product. So it is with great appreciation for everyone's time today that I get to share this information. My name is Michael. As I said, I sit with the World Resource Institute as a member of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Secretariat. And what I'd like to share today is to start with a very high-level overview of what is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate standard and associated guidance documents. How does it facilitate the data management and the reporting of an organization's greenhouse gas footprint? and then to go into the details surrounding the revision and information gathering process that we have started and looking to work with stakeholders globally over the next 1 to 2 year timeline. So to start off with a high-level review of just simply what is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and particularly the Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate standard.
Sorry to pause Michael. I don't think we are seeing the screen sharing here.
Thank you so much. That was my mistake. Let's try this. Can you now see the overview slide? Thank you. Apologies for that. So to give an overview of what the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is, essentially it is a series of documents that provides a standard and guidance material around how to quantify greenhouse gas emissions for an organization's operations and its value chain. What this does is enables companies, it could be cities, or potentially even countries, to first measure, and then with that information start to manage and report on its greenhouse gas emissions, again, from all of its operations. So these would be the direct emissions occurring in a business, but also the value chain emissions. When you purchase goods or you purchase services, what are the emissions embodied in that material or service? If you sell products, how do those move through the rest of their life cycle, generating emissions when someone else owns or uses them? And when it comes time to dispose of an item, what are the end of life emissions associated with that? Greenhouse Gas Protocol enables a system to track these emissions over time and track progress towards emission reduction targets. We've seen, since the first document was published in early, or I think it was around 2004, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standards, particularly the corporate standard, has grown to be widely adopted. We see more than 90% of the Fortune 500 companies, at least in the United States, using the Greenhouse Gas Protocol as the basis for their CDP or Carbon Disclosure Project disclosures. We also see the adaptation and practice of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol in many other areas of the economy and reporting programs. Later on, I'll touch on, we're seeing a significant increase in the usage of Greenhouse Gas Protocol for regulatory climate risk disclosure programs, which is one of the big reasons for this update process now. Last, the important piece to emphasize, and we'll continue to touch on this, is all of these standards, all of these guidance documents, every single piece of it has been developed through a global and inclusive multi-stakeholder process. We convene all sectors of the economy, academic research, industry, governments, nonprofits, private sector, civil society, and bring together all of the interested parties who want to come to the table, listen to all of the ideas, and help shape what is the appropriate and accurate reporting framework to enable these kinds and types of outcomes. So how do we do that? There's at least 6 different standards or guidances that are worth highlighting here in terms of the references and resources that are out there. All of these are available free for download on greenhousegas.ghgprotocol.org, linked at the bottom of the slide. Corporate standard is essentially the core foundational document. That would be the first place to start for an organization entering this process and looking to understand the reporting framework. There's also the corporate value chain or scope 3 standard, which helps facilitate reporting of all of the upstream and downstream emissions. The scope 2 guidance is specific to the energy industry and particularly the electric power sector. And so for anyone who consumes electricity and wants to quantify, we know that when you turn on a light bulb, you run a fan, an air conditioning unit, anything that consumes electricity, the carbon dioxide, the greenhouse gas emissions happen somewhere else. They're indirect emissions. We, the user of electricity, are responsible for the consumption of that power, which means we're the reason why it's being produced. How do we quantify those upstream emissions? We also have project level protocol and a project level standard for evaluating the specific emission impacts of a given product. So if you're making a consumable or you're making some sort of product that you sell specifically, how do you quantify the emissions embodied in that single good or potentially service as well. There's sector-specific guidance documents that are also available. We try to provide references to calculation tools as well as emission factors, but recognize there's a lot of resources out there, and it can be a challenge to quantify all of them or to review and verify or vet or even endorse those resources. In addition to the actual standards and guidance documents, we also offer online training courses that are, again, available today free of charge. So with that context around what is Greenhouse Gas Protocol, I want to spend just, I think, 2 slides talking about how does it work? What's the sort of big picture practice for using Greenhouse Gas Protocol? The first step is really to define as an organization. It might be a business, it might be an institution, it might be a city or a town, whatever the body that is trying to say, what are our greenhouse gas emissions? First, you essentially need to define what are the boundaries? What is inside your footprint? What are we responsible for in terms of emissions to the atmosphere? The Greenhouse Gas Protocol defines several different approaches to enable flexibility in reporting. You could either adopt an equity share, which is based on ownership. And so it looks to say how much of these operations, of this factory, of this business, of this store, office building, how much of that do you actually own as the controller of that facility? Or there's an approach that uses what type of control do you have over the facility? You might not be the owner of the building, but you could have complete control over its operations. What type of equipment is installed in the building? Do you run energy efficient appliances? Do you use thermostat controls or other resources to monitor and manage your energy consumption? And so there's a number of different ways that you can define what is inside of an entity's organizational or operational boundary. And that's really the first step in the reporting process, is to say, what are the equipment, what are the sources of emissions that our organization is responsible for? Once we define what areas and what the sources are of all of our emissions, we then move on to say, well, how do we quantify and think about the different ways that we are responsible for greenhouse gas emissions? Primarily, you can divide this into 2 big buckets. There are the direct emissions. If you own a gas turbine, if you have a oil, coal, gas boiler for heating, if you have direct emissions, maybe you have some sort of refrigerant gas that is emitted into the atmosphere. These are direct emissions that are coming from the resources, the facilities that are owned or controlled by the reporting company. They are direct emissions coming from that control. Where we see the majority of the emissions tend to occur in many sectors of the economy, though, are indirect emissions. The opening slide that we saw shows the impact of industry, which is a heavy consumer of energy. Some of that might be direct emissions where they're consuming, for example, maybe natural gas or coal or oil and burning it on site. But it also might be that they're a large consumer of electricity. And so if they're buying a lot of electricity, they're going to have significant indirect emission impacts. You're responsible, you're the reason why the electricity was generated, but where did that come from and how do you trace it back to its emission sources? So once you distinguish between direct and indirect emissions, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol then applies what is called Scope 1 emissions for direct emissions of greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide equivalents to the atmosphere from the facility's owned operations. And then within the indirect category, there's Scope 2 and Scope 3. In practice, Scope 2 tends to be specifically electricity emissions, but it also includes if your organization buys either purchases heat, which could be in the form of steam or hot water, or it could also be purchased cooling, for example, chilled water facilities on a district energy system. And then there's Scope 3, which is essentially everything else in that value chain. To look at this again in a different way, you could take direct emissions. Again, this is your Scope 1. These are the emissions from operations that are owned or controlled by the reporting company. You directly own those emissions. Indirect emissions are scope 2 and scope 3. Scope 2 is from purchased energy. Scope 3 is all of the other indirect emissions, essentially, that are not captured under scope 2. And to show it one more different way, just for sort of a pictorial representation, we have scope 1 to the atmosphere in the center. These are from, company facilities or maybe company vehicles. You have scope 2, which is from purchased electricity, steam, heating, cooling. And then scope 3, you could divide into both upstream emissions. These are the emissions that occur up your value chain. And so it's whatever the emissions embodied in your purchased goods and services, the delivery of that to your facilities, could also include the business travel of your employees or their employee commuting. And then downstream emissions. One of the biggest ones is use of sold product. And so, for example, a car would be a great example. Somebody buys a car and then drives it. And if it's a gasoline powered vehicle, the use of that vehicle will generate significant emissions. And so that would be captured in the downstream activities, use of sold product, scope 3 category. So with that understanding of sort of what is the greenhouse gas protocol, what are the different standards, how does it organize emissions, I want to now take us over to the revision process that we've started. So in terms of where we are today in this process, which I will emphasize is the very beginning of what will probably be about a 2-year period. We anticipate taking approximately 2 years' time to work through the updates and develop a revised set of standards and guidance documents. What we are seeking to do now, and through a series of surveys and requests for proposals that I'll speak to in just a second, is to look at just simply what is the need for an update? And if there is a need for an update in any one of these areas of the greenhouse gas protocol, what is the scope of that update? How big of an update are we talking about? Is this a small clarification or a substantial overhaul? And if there is a reason for change, why? Let's understand the reason for that change. What is not working or what could be working better? In doing this, we really want to emphasize alignment with best practices across the world. We want to make sure that whatever we develop is rigorous and credible as a foundation for greenhouse gas accounting. It should support progress towards science-based net zero emission targets that are in line with a global 1.5 degree temperature change. And another key element here is harmonization and alignment with major accounting rules that are under development. Numerous examples of this exist across the world where we're seeing a transition from voluntary reporting by organizations to mandatory reporting, where scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 potentially are required to report. If you're a business that operates in the European Union, the FRAG rules under the CSRD, corporate sustainability reporting disclosure, any organization or business in that purview will be required to report using greenhouse gas protocol, its scope 1, its scope 2, its scope 3 emissions. And so we've transitioned from it's a voluntary opportunity to promote progress and sort of advertise the positive climate undertakings an entity has pursued, to now it is a regulatorily required obligation to report. And again, throughout this process, it will be inclusive. We're looking for global participation with as many stakeholders as interested in participating through this process. 2 more slides to highlight essentially just what is this process going to look like. Where we are today is seeking feedback through the survey process, through the proposals. I'll talk about that on the last slide. That feedback we are looking to have complete by mid-March. Following all of that information coming in, we will work as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to review and summarize that information, and then come back to the world and share, here's what we've heard from stakeholders globally about the need and the scope, the scale, and the reason for any change to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Following that, we will convene technical working groups, subject matter experts, interested parties, impacted parties, to help work through technical questions. How do we evaluate different proposals, need for change, develop any modifications, and then work through pilot testing, review groups, etc., to make sure that whatever changes we might develop actually work, are actually feasible, are actually practicable. That process will play out through 2023 into 2024, and our target today is to finalize and publish updated standards and guidance in approximately 2 years' time. And the last slide that I have is, again, just emphasizing, we really want to hear from corporates and businesses, anyone with a greenhouse gas inventory. If you're involved in policy or planning, academic research, greenhouse gas emission reporting programs, or energy resource developers, if you own, operate, develop, or you're purchasing and buying renewable, new clean energy, zero emission energy technologies, we want to hear feedback and input through the survey process. There's a wide variety of the kind and types of expertise that we're looking at. Examples include sustainability officers, individuals doing inventory level accounting, auditors or third-party verification, if you're involved in climate strategy decisions, policymakers, regulators. And all of this feedback we've linked here comes in through these 4 different surveys, one focusing on the corporate accounting and reporting standard, a second survey focused on the Scope 2 guidance, a third survey focused on the Scope 3 standard, and a fourth survey focused on what we call market-based accounting generally. And the idea with that last survey is to say, whereas in the Scope 2 practice today, an entity is able to report both a location-based and a market-based Scope 2 footprint, we have no means or mechanism in Scope 1 or Scope 3 to use market instruments. A couple examples here would be, if you consume natural gas and you're just pulling it directly from a pipeline, the shared distribution pipeline system, but you have a contract with a biogas production or renewable natural gas facility somewhere else, and you want to buy certificates that say, well, I own the rights to that gas, how might you change what your Scope 1 footprint is? Or in Scope 3, you might say, we buy palm oil and we buy it from a low carbon production facility, but it's delivered through a shared delivery system. Maybe it's an ocean tanker, a train system, and palm oil from a sustainable farm as well as a less sustainable production facility are physically mixed together. And so there's no way to separately track it. Could you use market instruments, certificates, mass balance, or other mechanisms to quantify that and take credit for that type of engagement? The last thing I'll highlight is we are also looking for proposals to say, if you have an idea of how do we change the greenhouse gas protocol, the proposal template essentially says, here's the way that we need to think about any changes, answer and propose that idea through those questions to help then inform and enable how we might adopt that type of new approach within, whether it's a Scope 1, Scope 2, or Scope 3 guidance generally, and work through that together. So a high level overview, definitely want to make a lot of time here for questions and answer. I'm happy to go into any and all of this material or any other questions anyone might have. And the last thing I'll say before turning it back over to our host is, please feel free to reach out. More than happy to try and find time to connect with anybody who's interested, to have a conversation in more depth around the process, the questions, and what the next 2 years looks like as we work through this process together with everybody. So with that, again, a huge thank you to everybody for participation this morning, and looking forward to the rest of the presentations as well as question and answers. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Michael, for your overview on the survey. And now that we've finished the presentations from our speakers, I'd like to invite everyone to join the panel discussion. And here we will be answering your questions in the Q&A box, as well as any that may arise. First, I'd like to welcome our panelists, Mr. Michael from GHG Protocol, and Mr. Ma Khai Hin, and Mr. Quân Nguyễn from our team. And Mr. Dung Ho will be the moderator for the panel discussion.
Firstly, thank you so much, Hao, for beginning the transition towards the panel discussion, and great thanks again to Michael for the wonderful presentation on the topic of GHG protocols for the emission accounting standards. And I'd like to welcome all the panelists today, Michael, and for the first time, the ENER team, which we have the honor to have Mr. Kwon and Mr. Hyun here today with us. And they have been very, very kind to answer a lot of the questions in the Q&A boxes so far. We do see a lot of more questions coming in on a variety of topics, not just on GHG emission standards, but also on the compliance carbon market, and also on the voluntary market, as well as the EU regulation on CBAM. So just to stress that for today, we are focusing on the greenhouse gases emission standards. But as much as we can, we will try to answer the question you have on the carbon market in addition to that. But the panel discussion will focus on the GHG emission standards. Before we start the panel discussion, just to let Michael have some time to rest and let the ENER team to prepare himself, I think it's worth going through the Q&A section a little bit. There were a variety of questions. I think I would like to highlight some of the great questions out there. So one of the questions is that would the government would have a template for this new GHG reporting requirement domestically with a new decision that came out in January? And I think Ms. Hui has answered that hopefully succinctly. There will be guidance and template provided, and I think the unit of verification will be recognized with the UNFCCC framework, and so be certified to ISO 14065 standards. And that's one of the questions. And I think we also have questions on some of the guidance on the scope 3. I think as mentioned in Michael's slide, there are guidelines on how to account for scope 3 emissions with the GHG standards, and hopefully we can delve a little bit further into that as we go on to deepen the discussion. One last but not least, I think there was one question on the progress of the local carbon market and what is the cap or emission threshold or cap for facilities. I think from my understanding, the local carbon market is still in development, and there will be a pilot from 2025 to 2027. There is a committee that's formed between the different team from various ministries, whether that's from MONRE or from Ministry of Finance and other relevant ministries as well, to really spearhead this effort in the pilot. And then once an exact mechanism for the emission trading schemes has been established, I think there will be further information on the kind of whether there's a cap and trade system or this emission tax system. So that are some of the questions. I see that they will still have 23 questions in the line. So we will touch on that very soon. But first, I'd like to hopefully start the panel discussions, and perhaps we can go to the ENER team for that. And since the ENER team is very experienced in providing this the emission accounting services and work in Vietnam, I would like to switch back to my mother tongue with Vietnamese for this. Anh Quân và anh Hiền có nghe được em không ạ?
Dạ, xin chào quý anh chị tham gia buổi hội thảo ngày hôm nay ạ. Thay mặt ENER team thì cũng xin phép chia sẻ đến các anh chị. ENER team là một đơn vị tư vấn độc lập. Mình có kinh nghiệm là cung cấp các cái dịch vụ liên quan tới hiệu quả tài nguyên cũng như là kiểm kê khí nhà kính. Thì cũng như các anh chị thấy đó là chính phủ đã có những cái quy định về hoạt động kiểm kê khí nhà kính cho các cấp cơ sở. Thì đối với các doanh nghiệp là khách hàng của ENER team cũng như các cái nhà cung cấp cho các cái nhãn hàng, thì những năm gần đây cũng đã bắt đầu quan tâm và có cái yêu cầu và phải thực hiện các kiểm kê khí nhà kính cho phạm vi 1, phạm vi 2 cũng như một số các yêu cầu liên quan tới phạm vi 3. Thì thông qua buổi hội thảo ngày hôm nay cũng rất là mong là Enerteam cũng thông qua cái quá trình tìm hiểu cũng như làm việc với các cái đối tác các bên quốc tế, thì nếu có những cái chỗ câu hỏi hay là những cái vấn đề mà cần được chia sẻ từ phía các anh chị thì Enerteam cũng sẽ cập nhật và cũng như là chia sẻ những cái insight từ phía Enerteam đến quý anh chị ạ.
Em cảm ơn anh Quân nhiều ạ. Vậy chắc để bắt đầu cái buổi phiên thảo luận thì em cũng xin phép hỏi anh Quân là với cái trải nghiệm của mình tại thị trường Việt Nam sử dụng các cái tiêu chuẩn từ GHG Protocol hay các tiêu chuẩn khác thì có những cái ngành có thể những cái sector, những cái ngành công nghiệp, những cái ngành nào mà bên mình thường xuyên làm trong thời gian qua, và có những em nghĩ là mình sẽ tập trung vào những cái điểm mạnh trước của những cái tiêu chuẩn hiện hành, là có những cái điểm mạnh nào, ví dụ như phạm vi 1, phạm vi 2, phạm vi 3 thì anh Quân thấy là cái phạm vi nào hiện giờ đang làm nó dễ dàng nhất với team mình ạ?
Dạ, xin cảm ơn câu hỏi của anh ạ. Về cái phần thì các khách hàng mà Enerteam đã làm việc liên quan tới kiểm tra khí nhà kính thì mình thấy là quan sát thấy là các khách hàng trong lĩnh vực ngành thời trang, các công ty về may mặc, dịch nhuộm và da giày là những đơn vị mà họ có sự thúc đẩy và theo dõi từ phía các cái nhãn hàng, xu hướng đó là xu hướng chung của ngành thời trang. Thì được tiếp cận này là rất là sớm, từ khâu là các cái khóa, các cái đạo chương trình hành động vì khí hậu, hướng dẫn cho các cái doanh nghiệp này về tính toán kiểm kê, rồi sau đó họ cũng đã phát triển và tính toán những cái báo cáo chi tiết. Thì về khi mà thực hiện tính toán kiểm kê thì có các cái phạm vi 1, 2 và 3, thì các nhà máy tiếp cận bước đầu sẽ là phạm vi 1 và 2. Đối với phạm vi 3 thì sẽ là cái yêu cầu nâng cao. Thì các anh chị trong ngành thời trang nếu có tham gia chương trình về một cái công cụ đánh giá HIT-FEM sẽ thấy là phạm vi 1 và 2 sẽ là cái câu hỏi bắt buộc gọi là tính điểm, cái phần thể hiện cái kết quả thực hiện của nhà máy. Còn đối với phạm vi 3 thì sẽ là những câu hỏi nâng cao, gọi là thực hành tốt thôi, thì họ cũng chưa có đưa vào cái tiêu chí bắt buộc phải thực hiện đối với các nhãn hàng. Ngoài những ngành thời trang, ngoài ngành thời trang thì số những cái tập đoàn, những cái công ty lĩnh vực điện tử hay là một số những tập đoàn mà họ có những cái hoạt động là công bố những cái báo cáo phát triển bền vững, hay gần đây nhất các anh chị thấy các cái báo cáo về ESG, là về môi trường, về trách nhiệm xã hội và quản trị, thì họ cũng đặt ra cái yêu cầu là trong cái thành phần của báo cáo này sẽ có cái nội dung báo cáo liên quan đến kiểm kê khí nhà kính và các cái cam kết về mục tiêu giảm phát thải và cái chương trình hành động cụ thể. Thì đấy là những cái khách hàng mà Enerteam đã có làm việc.
Cảm ơn anh Quân. Vậy em cũng muốn quay lại câu hỏi đó một chút, là ở phạm vi 1 và 2 theo như công việc anh Quân thì có hai cái phạm vi đó, có cái phạm vi nào nó thực hiện dễ hơn hay còn lại không, hay là anh Quân có gặp khó khăn gì trong hai phạm vi này không?
Dạ, trong quá trình mà triển khai làm việc với khách hàng á, thì đối với phạm vi 1 và 2 thì rõ ràng là phạm vi 1 sẽ có nhiều cái hạng mục thành phần hơn, về là các cái nguồn phát thải thành phần phân chia ra theo tiêu chuẩn, thì mình sẽ gọi theo các cái nhóm là phát thải phạm vi 1 nguồn đốt cố định, phát thải phạm vi 1 nguồn đốt di động, và cuối cùng là mình phân cái nhóm còn lại gọi là nguồn phân tán. Thì các cái doanh nghiệp chủ yếu phát thải phạm vi 1 thì sẽ liên quan đến các cái nhiên liệu đốt, hay còn gọi là cái fuel ha, thì mình phân chia ra có hai loại là fossil fuel và biomass, nhiên liệu sinh khối. Ngoài những cái này ra thì phát thải nguồn phân tán thì mình sẽ thấy là có các cái ga môi chất lạnh. Đây là những cái thông tin mà có vẻ như là các doanh nghiệp trước đây người ta chưa có làm quen với cái tiêu chuẩn về hướng dẫn tính toán. Thì thông thường là các cái số liệu mà liên quan tới năng lượng như là nhiên liệu thì thường là doanh nghiệp có đầy đủ. Tuy nhiên đối với các cái môi chất lạnh hay là phát thải phân tán đến từ cái hoạt động xử lý nước thải thì các doanh nghiệp thường sẽ gặp khó khăn trong cái việc họ gọi là thống kê các cái dữ liệu dùng cho cái việc tính toán. Còn đối với phát thải phạm vi 2 thì ở Việt Nam mình chủ yếu là sử dụng nguồn điện lưới từ điện lưới quốc gia, thì mình sẽ căn cứ theo cái dữ liệu điện tiêu thụ trên hóa đơn của công ty, và hệ số phát thải áp dụng sẽ là hệ số phát thải công bố theo định kỳ của Cục Biến đổi Khí hậu, Bộ Tài nguyên Môi trường. Một số những cái nguồn phát thải phạm vi 2 khác, ví dụ như doanh nghiệp mà có mua năng lượng, cụ thể đây là mua hơi hoặc là mua các cái gọi là mua nhiệt, dầu nhiệt, hoặc là các cái hoạt động mua các công suất làm mát, thì nó cũng sẽ tính toán tương tự đối với phạm vi 1 về phương pháp tính. Tuy nhiên là sẽ xếp vào phạm vi 2 vì lúc này là phát thải là xảy ra ở cái đơn vị là nhà cung cấp dịch vụ. Thì đó là một số những cái quan sát của Energy trong quá trình mình làm việc tư vấn kiểm kê cho các doanh nghiệp.
Cảm ơn Quân nhiều. Vậy chắc bây giờ em xin phép quay lại với cái bối cảnh đó, em quay lại với Michael một chút để nhìn rộng hơn ngoài Việt Nam. So, Michael, so I think the ENER team has provided quite a good context of the situation in Vietnam, where the apparel sector has always been dominant and leading in this kind of, emission accounting initiative, and the kind of work being done there is focusing on scope 1 and scope 2. I was just wondering, what is the kind of general feedback that you have on the global, a bit perhaps on the regional level? Like, is it the same for other countries? Has it always been textile dominated, or any other comments on that? You're on mute.
Thank you. I'm not sure I totally caught the specifics of the question. Is it the sort of uniqueness of textile production and accounting for emissions from that industry?
What I meant is, I think perhaps the situation in Vietnam is that, anything has been doing a lot of work on emission accounting for the textile sector. Do we see more sector joining on a more global scale, or we still see the apparel sector as the dominant kind of, sector overall?
As in terms of just globally, where do we see the most emissions coming from, sector by sector globally?
And yes, and being accounted for, as in, companies actually doing all of this emission accounting reports.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think the answer was really going to depend and vary geographically. One of the things, historically, if we go back 15 years, where we saw a lot of reporting and early action was actually in, academic and higher education institutions were some of the most aggressive early adopters. In the United States, we've seen significant progress, particularly when it comes to purchasing or contracting with renewable energy, the tech sector, technology, and so the internet giants of the world who have massive data farms, tremendous, massive scope 2 footprints. Their entire business model is consuming electricity. And so they've been very, very proactive in trying to shape and form to push the envelope of how can we think about scope 2 accounting. There's, I think there's a lot of different sectors. We see manufacturing in general is a very large source. And I think what is really interesting, there's CDP did a report, I think in the last year, looking at probably maybe the top 10 or 15 sectors of the global economy, the biggest sources of emissions, and where did their emissions occur in the value chain. And for some industry, it's scope 1. It is absolutely and entirely cement. Cement manufacturing is an incredibly carbon intensive process. And so for them, their scope 3 is actually comparatively smaller. But for many, many organizations and business, scope 3 is the largest sector or scope of their emissions. And so it really, in terms of where the biggest emissions, a lot of it is going to be, what is the country or the region's predominant economic activity? And then looking at it to say, is this something that is in and of itself very energy intensive? Or do their emissions happen somewhere else and they have really high scope 3 emissions? And so it's just, again, going to vary region by region and sector by sector.
Thank you so much for the insights. I think it's wonderful that Michael and Mr. Kwon from the team has provided us with the kind of context, broad context, both on the global scale, the kind of emission that's going on in all three scopes, and the kind of sector that's contributing the most kind of emission in each of these scopes. And that situation in Vietnam is with the apparel sector leading the way, and hopefully with the more decisions coming, there'll be more, more work being done in this area. So I do see from the time of our discussion, like 10, 15 more questions popping up in the Q&A, and I feel like some of our audience might be waiting to hear the answer to that. So hopefully I can select some of the questions to direct to you, Michael and Mr. Kwon, and see if it's possible to answer them right now. So I think one of the questions from them that I have is that sorry, look at that again. So Michael, I think one of the questions is that with the current standards and perhaps with the revision of the standards, is there any way to account for double counting for scope 3? That's one of the questions. Oh, yeah.
Thank you. It's an interesting question, and the double counting in scope 3 is by design. And I think this is an area where, if you think back to that picture that I showed with the scope 1 arrow right in the middle, scope 2, and then scope 3 upstream and downstream emissions, the only real emissions to the atmosphere are scope 1 emissions. Everything else is someone else's scope 1 emission. And so when we talk about scope 2, if we are talking about our scope 2 footprint, it is the power sector's scope 1 footprint. If we're talking about our scope 3, maybe it's our purchased goods and services. Our scope 3 footprint, you mentioned textile industry, we might be the final manufacturer of a garment. And so we purchase, bolts of fabric, raw materials, or rather refined materials, but just sort of bulk material that we then finalize into some sort of garment. We buy that from an organization, and we'll talk about they are our scope 3 emissions. But that organization in turn bought their raw materials from someone else, and they talk about those emissions as their scope 3 emissions. And so by design, what scope 3 is designed to enable is to say, as the reporting entity, how do you look from that vantage point, both upstream and downstream, and say, what are the embodied emissions here? It does get challenging. And this is an area where I think feedback is helpful to say a scope 3 inventory is not specifically designed to be something that you can actually necessarily compare one organization's scope 3 to another. It's meant to be a tool for that company or that business to understand their emission operations, as opposed to being more of a comparative tool, the way that scope 1 can directly compare what are your actual emissions relative to someone else's. So definitely understand where the double counting questions come from. And I think we'd be interested in hearing feedback about the actual practice and what happens with that reality. But it is a design feature in the accounting framework that introduces what is called double counting in that case. But it's an interesting question, yeah.
Thank you for the insight, Michael. And like Michael have said, we have shared the survey links in the chat below. So any feedbacks you perhaps have on this double counting topics, or anything on the different scopes, feel free to access the link and complete the survey. We will be also sharing the survey afterwards together with materials from this from our presentation today, with approval from the panelists, of course, with the follow-up emails and also with the video recordings of the events today as well. So To touch a bit further on this scope 3, and I think there was some part about the supply chain engagement and the supplying of the data. I'll return to anh Quân for a little bit. Cho em hỏi bên anh Quân một chút xíu là với cái phạm vi 3 thì không biết bên mình đã có cái dự án nào hoặc khách hàng nào để hỗ trợ làm phạm vi 3 ở Việt Nam chưa? Cái trải nghiệm của mình có gặp khó khăn gì không?
Dạ. Về phạm vi 3 như Quân có trao đổi á, thì đây là cái yêu cầu gọi là nâng cao so với các cái doanh nghiệp mà tiếp cận. Thì cũng một số cái doanh nghiệp thì đối với ngành giày và một cái công ty mà bên Quân từng làm là ngành thời trang sức đá quý á, thì họ cũng đặt ra cái yêu cầu là mong muốn là bên mình tư vấn cho họ gặp có 2 cái hoạt động là đào tạo để họ nhận biết về cái phạm vi 3. Thứ hai là tiến hành là thực hiện kiểm kê số liệu phát thải phạm vi 3 của họ. Thì các cái khách hàng của mình khi mà tiếp cận ban đầu thì chưa có hình dung được cái khối lượng công việc, nó sẽ rất là nhiều cái thông tin cần phải thu thập và có những cái khó khăn trong quá trình thu thập thông tin. Thì sau khi trải qua cái quá trình đào tạo thì thông thường thì chủ động từ phía khách hàng họ sẽ thay vì kiểm kê mong muốn như ban đầu là 15 hạng mục theo cái tiêu chuẩn hướng dẫn, thì họ sẽ chỉ cho chọn lọc lại một số những cái hạng mục mà nó dễ dàng cho cái việc thu thập số liệu. Ví dụ như là các cái hạng mục liên quan đến việc di chuyển đi lại đi công tác của nhân viên, một số những cái hạng mục liên quan tới cái việc mà thu mua gọi là mua nguyên vật liệu đầu vào, hoặc là xử lý chất thải thôi. Còn những cái hoạt động còn lại thì họ sẽ gọi là cho những cái chu kỳ tiếp theo đi, thì bên phía công ty sẽ chuẩn bị đầy đủ hơn để việc tính toán. Thì gần nhất là mình có làm việc cho các cái công ty trong lĩnh vực thời trang và lĩnh vực trang sức đá quý. Thì cái mình nhận thấy ở đây là trước khi làm kiểm kê phạm vi 3 thì các doanh nghiệp nên phải có cái thao tác là mình đã thực hiện qua kiểm kê phạm vi 1 và 2 để mình hiểu được cái quy trình làm việc cho một cái hoạt động kiểm kê là gì. Rồi cũng nên tham gia qua cái quá trình là một cái hoạt động là đào tạo để mình hiểu rõ những cái phát thải cũng như cái cách thức tính toán sẵn có cho các cái nguồn phát thải. Thì lúc này thì cái thời gian mà mình thu thập số liệu hay là mình chuẩn bị cái biểu mẫu để thu thập số liệu thì nó sẽ sẵn sàng hơn. Tới khi mình bước vào cái khâu mà tính toán kiểm kê, nó sẽ đảm bảo tính được cái kết quả nó giống với cái hoạt động thực tế của công ty nhất.
Em cảm ơn anh Quân ạ. Theo luôn cái chủ đề về các nhà máy nên tham khảo các biểu mẫu thì có một câu hỏi cũng là thường các nhà máy nên tham khảo biểu mẫu này ở đâu?
Dạ, về biểu mẫu dùng cho báo cáo thì khi mà mình thực hiện kiểm kê phạm vi 3 thì mình căn cứ theo tiêu chuẩn từ GHG Protocol cho cái scope 3. Thì trong tiêu chuẩn mình sẽ có là cái tiêu chuẩn hướng dẫn và cái hướng dẫn kỹ thuật technical guidance cho cái scope 3 này. Còn về cái công cụ thì thường mình thấy là cái tool nó thì phải có một cái form Excel. Thì theo như GHG Protocol thì mình thấy là có cái tool là được phát triển làm dạng online thôi. Thì trong này thì mình thấy là các cái hệ số mặc định được sử dụng khá là nhiều. Thì đối với doanh nghiệp Việt Nam mà thực hiện theo cái tool này thì mình thấy nó sẽ có cái gọi là cái độ chênh lệch giữa cái thực tế hoạt động ở Việt Nam và cái môi trường mà mình xây dựng cho cái tool đó. Thì nếu như team mà thực hiện cho khách hàng thì mình sẽ xây dựng một cái tool tính toán riêng, công cụ hình thức giống như là một cái file Excel mà nó có nhiều cái trang tính. Thì trong đó mình sẽ trình bày từng cái hạng mục theo các cái trang tính. Còn cái biểu mẫu mà để gọi là báo cáo mà trình bày ở dạng có thể là trình bày bằng cái file Word mô tả, thì mình có thể tham khảo từ cái biểu mẫu mà cũng có chia sẻ từ phía Protocol. Thì trong đó cũng có cái cấu trúc là mô tả các cái phạm vi và ranh giới, mô tả cái tiêu chuẩn áp dụng, mô tả cái chu kỳ kiểm kê và cuối cùng là mô tả chi tiết các cái hạng mục về dữ liệu hoạt động, về hệ số phát thải mà mình chọn áp dụng. Thì cuối cùng là cái phần tổng kết cái quá trình mà mình thực hiện qua cái số liệu. Yeah. Thì biểu mẫu mình có thể tham khảo từ website.
Em cảm ơn anh Quân và em cũng xin phép quay lại với Michael để nói chuyện trao đổi thêm về những cái tool cũng như là cái nguồn tài liệu để các nhà máy có thể tham khảo ở trên trang web của GHG. So Michael, we have been discussing the kind of resources that the factories may use in the process of their emission accounting, and Mr. Kwon has mentioned that there are tools and resources and guidance available on the GHG Protocol website. And perhaps for other countries, it might be obvious, they have used it before, but can you just share a bit more about the available tools? Is it a kind of web app or any case studies that they can use across the different scopes accounting?
Yeah, it's an interesting area that we increasingly, and I think will only become more and more important going forward, how to enable the reporting and making it easy as possible. If you go to Greenhouse Gas Protocol or ghgprotocol.org, there is a link up at the very top to calculation tools that provides frequently asked questions, as well as links to calculation tools, calculator tools, scope 3 evaluation metrics, trying to do quick quantifications. To some degree, there's a little bit of a challenge here in terms of you get what you pay for. And when you find free products, they're helpful, but they're not necessarily going to get you to the finish line. There are many products and services out there, consultant groups that provide these kinds and types of services. But it's an area that we are very, very conscious of in terms of how do we enable and improve this going forward. And so a lot of thinking going on, in addition to, we talked about simply updating, improving, enhancing the standards so that the guidance, the requirements of what and how to report are enhanced and evolve forward. But in parallel to that, how do we improve calculation tools, ability for Greenhouse Gas Protocol to look at a product or a service and say, yes, this is in conformance with the standards or guidance documents. We can put a stamp on it. We can say this is Greenhouse Gas Protocol certified. It's important to note, however, there's no reporting program for an entity to say, we've done our emissions inventory and report that to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. We don't have a reporting program. We're not a verification body. There's a lot of other things in the world that are those services and are those tools. We are really just the framework for the accounting, although we are also working to try and enable and unlock these tools. So will it happen overnight? Probably not. But I think over the coming years, there will be incredibly rapid and strong development and enhancement to these tools and sectors. But again, the first thing I would recommend for everybody is ghgprotocol.org, and then look for the calculation tools link, and that will provide a great starting point to go find additional information, resources, and tools. So hopefully that's a good starting point. And I think there's a lot more to come on that over the next months to years.
Perfect. Thank you, Michael. And just one last question for the audience, since you touched on that, GHG Protocol is not the organization to really verify that CAP standards. There was one question from audience, and how do GHG Protocol actually work with, initiative like the SBTIs, other initiative like that to support facilities that have the targets for SBTI?
Yeah, SBTI is a very close partner to WRI and WBCSD, the two co-conveners of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. WRI is a founding member of Science-Based Targets, SBTI, and we see them as a critical partner in this pathway forward. To build on the sort of verification and reporting frameworks, the protocol is an accounting and reporting tool. Science-Based Targets is a great example of a target setting or net zero program, which that quantify, what does it mean to actually hit a net zero target? What does it mean to have an emission reduction that is consistent with what science is telling us is required? That's much more of a role for an organization like Science-Based Targets or some of the net zero emission initiatives that are in place. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol, again, is really just simply designed to be the framework and the tool. An example from the financial sector would be we have GAAP accounting, generally accepted accounting practices, GAAP. That is simply a tool to facilitate financial disclosures, accounting disclosures. Greenhouse Gas Protocol is much more like that than something like Science-Based Targets, which says using accounting, how do you produce progress or sort of verify and show what progress towards the appropriate. Important distinction there between those two organizations. But again, I think there's close partnership, regular communication, and frequent engagement.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I think that's wonderful. So I'd like to stop a bit now with the Q&A box and go back to our kind of discussion. Before doing so, I think it is important to note that, like Michael said, a lot of the free tools and resources can be accessed on GHG Protocol website. However, you should note that these are freely available resources, so it might not be sufficient to meet the specific kind of service you're looking for. And I think CEIA today have a team on the events, and we're happy to connect you with any team or any other service provider that is in the space of emission accounting, because we are not promoting any particular company. It just happened that today we have the whole team here to support, and we really value the insight so far. So happy to follow up with that in our subsequent emails after the webinar with all the resources and the survey. So going back to I think the review, I think the GHG protocol standards. I think I'd like to go to the energy team to see. We have covered what is working in Vietnam. Perhaps we want to know a bit more what's not working. Anh Quân với anh team cho em xin hỏi một xíu, thì trong cái thời gian qua khi mình đã thực hiện các dự án về kiểm kê khí nhà kính trong phạm vi 1, 2, 3 thì không biết là khi sử dụng cái GHG Protocol, cái quy chuẩn của GHG Protocol thì hay là cái quy trình thì mình có gặp cái khó khăn gì không ạ? Cho những cái ngành nghề nào cụ thể?
Dạ, xin cảm ơn câu hỏi. Về cái gọi là cái khó khăn mà khi lựa chọn áp dụng theo tiêu chuẩn của GHG Protocol đó, thì các anh chị thấy thì cũng giống như các cái tiêu chuẩn ISO khác, thì mình sẽ không có gọi là kỳ vọng ở một cái tiêu chuẩn mà thông qua cái việc đọc tiêu chuẩn mà chúng ta có thể thực hành được cái việc mà tính toán cho một cái báo cáo kiểm kê khí nhà kính. Thì ở đây mình phải quan điểm là tiêu chuẩn là đưa ra được những cái yêu cầu về mặt cái phương pháp luận, về mặt cái hướng để chúng ta có tổ chức cái dữ liệu hay là cái cách thức chúng ta tính toán thôi. Còn khi mà đi vào tính toán thì mình thấy là công ty ở góc độ công ty nha, nếu mà mình tự thực hiện sẽ gặp khó khăn ở chỗ là mình sẽ phải xác định đúng được các cái nguồn phát thải, xác định đủ các cái nguồn phát thải. Cái thứ hai là khi đã đủ nguồn phát thải rồi, phải giải quyết cái khó khăn tiếp theo là có thu thập được cái dữ liệu hoạt động tương ứng với nguồn phát thải đó hay không. Và cái thứ ba là khi mà đã có dữ liệu hoạt động rồi thì công ty có thu thập được hay là tra cứu được cái hệ số phát thải tương ứng của cái nguồn phát thải đó hay không. Thì khi mà đến cái hệ số phát thải thì các anh chị sẽ gặp khó khăn theo kiểu là mình có rất là nhiều các cái bên công bố cái hệ số phát thải. Vậy thì anh chị sẽ sử dụng cái hệ số phát thải được công bố bởi bên nào là nó phù hợp. Vì lý do là có cái trường hợp luôn lấy ví dụ như là phát thải từ đốt nhiên liệu sinh khói đi, thì sẽ có những cái nền tảng báo cáo hay là cái tiêu chuẩn báo cáo họ quan điểm là phát thải từ sinh khói hệ số phát thải là bằng 0, nhưng mà cũng có những cái nền tảng báo cáo họ quan điểm là phát thải sinh khói là có hệ số phát thải. Thì nếu mà chúng ta lựa chọn cái hệ số phát thải theo tiêu chuẩn nào thì mình cố gắng là trong cái báo cáo của chúng ta nên follow theo, hay là chúng ta hướng theo một cái nguồn công bố hệ số phát thải Thì cũng thấy cũng có câu hỏi trong cái mục hỏi á, thì có anh chị hỏi là có các cái bên ví dụ như ngành thời trang thì sẽ có cái HIT FEM, công cụ công bố hệ số phát thải, rồi cũng có các cái đơn vị người ta áp dụng theo hệ số phát thải của US EPA, cơ quan bảo vệ môi trường Hoa Kỳ công bố. Rồi ở chính phủ Việt Nam thì mình thấy cũng đã có quyết định số 2626 của Bộ Tài nguyên Môi trường công bố cái hệ số phát thải, và ở đây mình có đối chiếu thì cái nguồn mà hệ số phát thải này thì tham khảo từ báo cáo của IPCC, Ủy ban Liên Chính phủ về biến đổi khí hậu. Thì đây là những cái nguồn dữ liệu mà hệ số phát thải mình thấy là chủ yếu mà được tra cứu nhiều cho đến hiện tại. Ngoài ra mình cũng có thể kể thêm của US, của UK đáp ra, thì trước mắt là chúng ta nên chọn một cái suột về hệ số phát thải mà nó đầy đủ cho cái mục đích báo cáo. Ví dụ anh chị báo cáo theo cho yêu cầu của Thủ tướng Chính phủ thì mình sử dụng hệ số được công bố bởi Bộ Tài nguyên và Môi trường. Anh chị báo cáo theo nền tảng HIT FEM thì mình sẽ sử dụng cái hệ số phát thải theo HIT FEM để nó phù hợp với cái nền tảng mà anh chị báo cáo. Còn về mặt lâu dài thì mình nghĩ là chắc cũng phải có một cái bên gọi là thống kê và refer, hoặc là gọi là khuyến cáo đối với cái báo cáo thì có thể sử dụng các hệ số phát thải theo những cái nguồn được ưu tiên này, thì lúc đó doanh nghiệp họ sẽ dễ dàng hơn trong cái việc mà tra cứu cũng như ưu tiên lựa chọn hệ số phát thải nào cho việc áp dụng.
Cảm ơn Quân ạ. Chắc là nhắc tới hệ số phát thải thì có một câu hỏi cũng mất được trả lời, anh Quân trả lời, nhưng mà chắc em nghĩ là mọi người tham gia cũng sẽ muốn nghe câu trả lời trực tiếp luôn, đó là hiện tại các nhà máy kiểm kê khí nhà kính theo công cụ của GHG Protocol có được chấp thuận để báo cáo cho cơ quan nhà nước chưa? Và nếu nhà máy không sử dụng các hệ số phát thải của GHG Protocol mà sử dụng hệ số phát thải của Higgs Index trong Higgs Index thì có được không?
Dạ, mình cũng mới vừa trao đổi về cái hệ số phát thải á. Thì tính đến hiện tại thì mình thấy trong quy định của Nghị định 06 thì sẽ nói là phương pháp dùng cho cái phương pháp luận dùng cho cái việc tính toán kiểm kê theo Nghị định 06 thì sẽ là tham khảo từ cái hướng dẫn của IPCC. Thì theo hướng dẫn của IPCC thì họ cũng có cái tài liệu hướng dẫn, và trong đó cũng đã có đề cập cái hệ số phát thải, thì họ phân chia theo các cái gọi là các cái volume, thì mình phân chia theo các cái lĩnh vực á, là lĩnh vực về năng lượng và lĩnh vực về công nghiệp và sản xuất. Thì phân chia theo lĩnh vực đó thì họ lại có cái bảng tra rất là chi tiết cho các cái loại nhiên liệu hay là các cái hoạt động cụ thể, thì mình sẽ tham khảo theo cái chỗ này. Về còn cụ thể hơn là sử dụng như thế nào, nhân chia thế nào á, thì mình cũng đang chờ những cái hướng dẫn chi tiết hơn, gọi là hướng dẫn kỹ thuật từ phía các cái bộ quản lý lĩnh vực. Như mình cũng có nói là tùy thuộc vào cái nền tảng báo cáo, tùy thuộc vào cái người đọc cái báo cáo mà các anh chị sẽ lựa chọn cái hệ số phát thải cho phù hợp. Thì cái mà anh Quân nghĩ là doanh nghiệp cần thiết ở đây là anh chị chuẩn bị cái sự chính xác cho cái dữ liệu hoạt động. Ví dụ anh chị tiêu thụ bao nhiêu kWh điện, anh chị đốt bao nhiêu tấn than, bao nhiêu tấn sinh khói, anh chị sử dụng bao nhiêu lít xăng, bao nhiêu lít dầu, nạp bao nhiêu mol chất lạnh, thì mình thống kê cho chính xác cái dữ liệu hoạt động. Thì còn cái việc mà báo cáo thì theo nền tảng nào thì mình sử dụng cái hệ số được công bố theo cái nền tảng đó. Yeah.
Cảm ơn anh Quân ạ. Vậy chắc cũng xin phép quay lại với lại Michael một chút về các cái khó khăn trong việc sử dụng cái quy chuẩn của Greenhouse Gas Protocol Standard. So Michael, so I think you've heard the kind of challenges in Vietnam when we want to conduct emission accounting, and do you hear the similar kind of challenges elsewhere, or any further kind of challenges? And with particular to the emission factor, selections, any advice on that you can have?
Absolutely, yes, on the same challenges. I think those are challenges that the entire world faces in terms of getting that data. It tends to be, in many ways, the emission factor, a ton of coal, we have a really good, it's the same number regardless of if it's this type of coal, these are the emissions. If it's this type of gasoline and this type of vehicle, or, it's fairly easy math. It gets much harder, much faster as soon as you move away from scope 1. When you get into scope 2 and you say, what's the right electricity grid emission factor? Some places in the world have really good data. The grid operator or the government or some organization provides really high quality data, very granular, very high resolution, it's audited, it's verified, etc. That is not necessarily the way that it is in most parts of the world, however. And so we recognize it creates a significant challenge to get good emission data when the data that you have putting into the calculation is less than perfect. And as you move to scope 3, I was talking with somebody recently who works at a major sort of verification audit company, one of the big 4 accountant companies in the world. And they shared that they have staff that they are sending to their clients for hundreds of thousands of dollars a year contract. And it's their entire job is to try and chase down emission factors of the company's suppliers. That's all they're doing, is they're getting on the phone, they're calling people up, they're trying to chase the data down, and it's just too hard to find. And the problem here is it's not only necessarily hard to find the emission factor data in some instances, it can also be a challenge, and it is a real challenge for some organizations to get their activity data. It might be really challenging to get all of their utility bills. It might be really, you could get one bill for the year. Can you get 12, can you get all 12 months of your utility bills for organizations and businesses? Not always, not necessarily. It can be much harder than it seems like it should be. And then as you go into scope 3 and say, well, exactly how many tons, liters, gallons, yards, whatever unit of measure of this did we buy or that did we sell? What is it like in its product use phase? That gets really hard. And so we absolutely recognize that, and it creates a very interesting tension around how could we devise or sort of develop improved standards that potentially bring more accuracy and more sort of a rigorous accounting for emissions, but only by virtue of having significantly more data. And so to use an example, we're seeing with some of the large tech companies, some of the biggest technology companies in the world, saying we want to see 24/7 emission accounting for scope 2. And the way that this works is that for every hour, you need to understand what your electricity emission load is. Not every month, not every bill, not every year, but 8,760 hours of the year, you need to know what your electricity load is, and then match hour by hour renewable energy generation to your load. If you have really sophisticated metering and you have a really good energy tracking system that can actually tag renewable energy credits or energy attribute certificates on an hourly basis, that might be a really productive, helpful way to improve renewable energy development and the accuracy of the accounting. But is it available and accessible to most parts of the world? And if it isn't, how do we think about that from an accounting perspective? So that's one of the questions, particularly if you look within the scope 2 guidance, there's some very specific targeted questions asking things like the time matching requirements. Today we use annual matching. What are the implications of changing that? What would it mean if the greenhouse gas protocol tried to push people to say, we need monthly level reporting or something even more granular? So it's something we're very, very cognizant of. Totally echo everything that that was said in terms of the challenges, the difficulties of getting emission factors. I hear that every part of the world. I've done inventory accounting myself, and those are the exact same problems that I had as well. And so it creates a really tricky challenge of how do we make an accounting standard that's accessible and available globally, but also really high impact and drives change. So again, these are the questions that we want feedback on.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Michael. I think very quick note on that. There's a question from, I think, audience, and it will help the early service provider like team in Vietnam and other service provider that is there any resources, advice on the kind of ways to track and manage and store this kind of data for consulting firm like team themselves on GHG Protocol or any other websites?
It's a good question. I will answer first from my own personal experience, and this is not Greenhouse Gas Protocol. This is just my past professional experience. When I started doing the inventory for an organization, it was all in one gigantic, really messy Excel spreadsheet. And it was a nightmare trying to manage it and make sure everything was correct. That organization eventually transitioned to using a online greenhouse gas inventory management software. On one hand, that was really nice because we had this centralized database. On the other hand, it meant we had to maintain it and make sure everything was accurate, and the database could do some things okay and other things less well. So it solved some problems but created new problems. From a greenhouse gas protocol perspective, we're able to review, but this is again a service and area that I think we're looking to expand our capability. The protocol would not provide a tool to do this, but we could look to review and confirm and sort of say, yes, this tool works in accordance with the protocol standards and the guidance practices. But in terms of making specific recommendations beyond the sort of simple templates and tools that we have available, again, on the resources page of ghgprotocol.org, it becomes, and it's a hard challenge for us to say, as a central source of the standards, how do we interact with, it's challenging to say, what if we endorse one product versus another? We want to really shy away from that space. So I don't know that I have a whole lot of specific answer to that question.
No worries. I think, thank you so much for sharing. I think those are very valuable insights that you can have. And just to be very cautious of the time, it's already 10:24, I can't believe it's already half an hour discussion. So to kind of close the panel discussions, I first go to team with this, reviewing process of the GHG Protocol. Em xin phép hỏi anh Quân cũng như đội team là với cái quy trình đang cải thiện cái quy chuẩn của GHG Protocol thì team có những phản hồi gì để các cái tiêu chuẩn này có thể được thực hiện tốt hơn tại Việt Nam không ạ?
Về phản hồi chi tiết thì các tiêu chuẩn của GHG Protocol thì mình thấy là phân ra các cái cấp độ là gọi là corporate standard, tiêu chuẩn hướng dẫn cho cấp độ tổ chức, rồi sau đó mới tới hướng dẫn cho phạm vi 3 là scope 3 standard, và cuối cùng là cái tiêu chuẩn cho kiểm kê dấu vết vòng đời sản phẩm thì gọi là cái carbon footprint product standard. Thì về mặt góp ý đầu tiên thì mình nghĩ là nếu được thì GHG Protocol có thể xem xét bổ sung một cái ngôn ngữ cho các cái tiêu chuẩn trong cái version mới á, thì mình bổ sung thêm cái ngôn ngữ tiếng Việt, vì lý do là cái rào cản ngôn ngữ cũng là một cái rào cản khá là lớn đối với các cái anh chị mà mình có làm việc các cái doanh nghiệp, thì để họ có thể dễ dàng cho cái việc tham khảo cũng như dùng cho cái huấn luyện nội bộ. Còn về cái cụ thể những cái vấn đề về kỹ thuật thì mình cũng đã thấy GHG Protocol cũng đã xây dựng cái biểu mẫu thu thập online, những cái survey online, thì team cũng đã có những cái đóng góp cái survey online. Thì gần nhất như trong quá trình mình làm việc với các nhãn hàng ngành thời trang cho cái khóa học đào tạo hành động vì khí hậu, thì cũng có cái sử dụng cái công cụ của GHG Protocol, cái gọi là cross sector tool, công cụ mà gọi là công cụ chung cho cái việc tính toán á, mình cũng dùng cho cái việc đào tạo. Thì trong quá trình sử dụng mình cũng có phát hiện một số những cái gọi là cái vấn đề về kỹ thuật trong công cụ, cũng đã có gửi cái phản hồi góp ý đến GHG Protocol. Thì mình thấy là cái công cụ này cũng đang trong quá trình được cập nhật sau cái phiên bản beta, Thì hy vọng là với cái phiên bản tới thì những cái vấn đề kỹ thuật đó đã được khắc phục.
Cảm ơn Quân. So returning to Michael, so hopefully there'll be more feedbacks from our audience and from companies like Enerteam for GHG Protocol. But I think there's a few questions regarding the process. I think some be cautious that how often will you guys be doing this kind of revision, and how would like newcomers, like factories, companies, would they find this? How are they not access it easily and not confused by the different updates to the protocol?
It's a good question, and it's one we've thought a lot about. This process, as I discussed, we envision being essentially, hopefully 2 years. Maybe it takes a little longer, maybe it's a little shorter, we'll see. After we go through this big update, this is the first time the protocol has ever tried to say, let's take every single one of our corporate standards, scope 2 guidance, scope 3, lift them all up at once and try to change everything simultaneously. Ideally, going forward, once we do this one-time big heavy lift, the next changes are small and the next changes are more frequent. And so when you go to you go to download a guidance or protocol or standard, it will be very clear what version you're downloading, what changes have happened, include discussion around why any changes may have happened, the sort of basis for conclusion around what's the reason why a change was made. And so that will become a transparent process. And hopefully we do one big lift now, and then in 2 years time, when we finish, and so that's 2 years into the future, and then another year or 2 years, it's small adjustments, it's incremental improvements. It's only in one place and not everywhere. And again, I also want to emphasize, we still don't know what the total scope of the updates will be. It might be significant, it might be much smaller. That's part of the survey process, is to understand how much change is needed and in what sequencing do we make these changes go into effect. So, but I think we want to do more frequent, much smaller improvements to sort of stay on top of things, as opposed to wait, and then have something very large to do all at once.
Thank you for your sharing, Michael. And once again, thank you for the insights from the GHG Protocol, and thank you, Angwon and Anghian, for joining us today. Great insights from Enerteam as well. And I understand that there's still quite a few questions left, and my apologies that we could not address all of those today, but please feel free to reach out to us after the event. We will try our best to respond to the question that you have with regards to the standards or the survey, which we will also share after this. So with that, I'd like to close the panel discussion and return the floor to our wonderful MC of the day, Han.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that it's right around time. And firstly, I'd like to say thank you to all the partners and speakers for joining, and all of you taking the time out of your busy schedules means the world to me. Today, we've learned about the new GHG protocol standards and process and its stakeholder surveys. We certainly hope to see the survey to be of great use in addressing GHG emissions and reduction claims. Thank you once again for joining us, and have a nice day. And you can find the link to the survey in the chat box, and we will also include that in the email that we send out regarding the presentations.